So hello and welcome to today's webinar, where we will be discussing the topic of reducing the risk of data exfiltration. My name is Gail Carpenter. I am the head of field and channel marketing here at Logpoint, and I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Niels Crimney, who's one of our senior sales engineers. This is actually the second webinar in our Maximising Your Investment in Converged SIEM series. The webinar will last around 30 minutes. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. So if you do have any, please put them into the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of the session. We're also recording this webinar, so it will be available on demand in the next couple of days. So what are we going to be talking about in the next 30 minutes or so? Before I hand over to Niels, I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about the topic of data exfiltration. What is it? How does it happen? And what are some of the recommendations that can be provided to organisations to stop this particularly cybersecurity attack happening to them? I will then be handing over to Niels, who will be taking us through a demo of how Logpoint Converged SIEM can actually help with data exfiltration. And as I mentioned, we will be finishing with a Q&A. So please put any questions that you would like into the chat box and we will get to them at the end of the session. So to start, what is data exfiltration? There's many definitions. But one definition is that data exfiltration is the theft or unauthorized removal of data from a device or network for malicious purposes. And when we're talking about data, we're talking about lots of different things. It can be qualitative data, so things like if you're looking for business information around mergers and acquisitions or company information. Or it can be more quantitative data, so things like personal information for your customers or staff, social security numbers. Another common thing that people are looking for is usernames or associated passwords that can help, help people access your network. But pretty much what it is they are looking for information and data that cybersecurity criminals can actually sell or use against organisations. Now, data exfiltration is not one company's problem. It can be a problem of an organisation if you have 5 people. It is a massive problem to large organisations such as Apple, LinkedIn, Microsoft, all of who have had huge breaches. If you had information that you do not want getting out in the public domain, then data exfiltration is a problem. So how does actually data exfiltration happen? Well, one of the main ways that it happens is through external threats. Cybersecurity criminals on the outside of your organisation trying to get into it to steal the data. And there's a number of different ways that they do this. One of the ways, of course, is malware. They're looking to get malware onto the network so they can steal the data through that way. Through phishing attacks, and as you see at the bottom, one of the biggest forms of data exfiltration is through phishing emails. Lateral movement, for example, past the hash, and this is something that Niels will go into a bit more detail about in a few minutes, and social engineering. Once they get the malware onto the network, there's often different ways that they actually approach stealing the data. So sometimes, cybersecurity criminals go into the organization, they spread the malware, they infiltrate devices, and they grab as much data as they possibly can. So it's usually quite quick when these attacks happen. Other scenarios is that when they put the malware onto the network and it can lay dormant for quite a long period of time. It's undetected and it's just waiting for the right time and the right data to exfiltrate. So they could be looking for a particular type of data. And as I mentioned, phishing is one of the biggest problems that we have with data exfiltration. I'm sure we've all received emails from what we thought is our CEO or from a company that we work with, for example, Royal Mail, when you're expecting a package, that you just need to click on a link to track your package. And of course, some people just do this without thinking. So external threats is a huge issue when it comes to data exfiltration. But of course, internal threats are just as important. And when we're talking about internal threats or insider threats, there's 2 types of insider threats that we're looking at. One is around malicious and one is not so malicious. So, of course, there is in organisations where there is employees who are working for the company for some reason want to cause harm to the business, whether it's for their own gain or for somebody else's gain. So they want to steal data that is sensitive to that organisation and take it out of the organisation. And there's a number of different ways that they do this. So one way, of course, is sending secure data to a third party. So often a way of doing this is emailing sort of Excel spreadsheets to a Gmail or a Hotmail account, putting data onto a hard drive or to a cloud share that you can download at a later time. Often, if you work for an organization for a long time and you know their security system and some of the controls, it's quite easy for them to get around them if they've got a lot of technical know-how. And a big example of this was Amazon a few years ago. They had some data exfiltration breaches in 2018 and 2020, and they had to inform their customers that they had been breached as a result of a malicious insider. And of course, Amazon have got a lot of customers. So, of course, we do have the malicious insiders, but of course, insider breaches that are not malicious are also very, very common. And often it is just an employee who just makes some sort of careless mistake. It could be just being vulnerable with their password, leaving it lying around. It could be just clicking on a suspicious email when they shouldn't be. But ultimately, the result is still the same. That information that the company is sensitive to the organization is still leaving the business. So whether it's external threats in malicious insider or a more of a non-malicious insider, unfortunately, the consequences are still the same when data gets exfiltrated from an organization. So, I mean, some of the consequences, I mean, these are quite common, but just to highlight a couple, obviously ransomware attacks. Holding data to ransom is a very common form of ransomware. So if a cyber criminal has, access to patient records or anything that's data sensitive, then they often hold an organization to ransom to try and get it back. Of course, data security and data breaches are a very big part of compliance, particularly around things like GDPR. So, of course, if these are breached, it is often organizations are liable to big fines. Of course, reputational and financial damage. I know, for example, when I've had an organization that I've worked with that's been breached, it does actually make me reevaluate my faith in them. Operational disruption. So, of course, if you have some sort of data exfiltration incident, or you think you might have a malicious insider, then of course that does cause disruption to your operations. IP theft is a big thing in terms of IP and being stolen from organizations. And of course, if you do have these types of attacks, you do need to look at them, and of course that can increase your cybersecurity costs. So we talked a bit about data exfiltration, what it is, how it happens. So what are some of the recommendations? So I'm not going to go through all of these because Niels will be talking about some of these in a moment, but just to highlight a couple of recommendations around data exfiltration and how it can be prevented. So from an internal perspective, one of the things that is recommended to organizations is around network segmentation. A lot of employees have access to data that they don't need, and particularly if they change roles in the organization, then often their access to data isn't changed to reflect the role that they're currently in. So implementing network segmentation is often considered a good policy when you're looking at this type of cybersecurity attack. Another area that we talk a lot about at Logpoint is around making sure that all your data sources are part of, for example, a Converged SIEM system. Because sometimes there is some data sources that are not included in some of your log analysis or your real-time monitoring and are often being missed. And often these are some of the data sources that are being targeted by cyber criminals. And a good example of this is SAP. Another area that is recommended is to analyze the patterns of user behavior. Again, this is very prominent for the insider threats. So identifying abnormal activity with users, for example, if they're coming in the middle of the night and downloading a large amount of data, could be a red flag to a security expert. Compliance reporting, of course, is something that is very important, as well as user awareness and training. So making sure that they don't click on that phishing email, and also forensic analysis. So when a data breach does actually happen, we have the tools available to make sure that you can see what's happened and make sure that it doesn't happen again. So of course, another recommendation that we have, and I'll be shortly handing over to Niels, is around Converged SIEM. So Logpoint's Converged SIEM system, very briefly, it is an end-to-end security operations platform. And the objective of it is to detect, investigate, and respond. So detect if there's any type of breach, investigate what happened, and immediately respond to that breach. And we do that in a number of different ways, through alert enrichment, orchestration and automation of manual processes, out-of-the-box playbook for investigation and response, particularly around our SOAR solution. And also we have high visibility of everything that's happening on different parts of the network, whether that's endpoints, applications, or the network itself. It's a fully consolidated platform, which includes all products, including SAP, as I mentioned, which is a big area for data. And it's visibility coupled with textual information. So it collects all the information together and presents it in a very visual way, which is easy for the security analyst. And of course, having a converged SIEM solution does reduce the total cost of ownership. So I'm just going to then hand over to Niels, who's going to take you into a bit more detail about how data exfiltration can be solved by Logpoint.
Thank you, Gail. I'll just share my screen. I hope that comes across all right. And I am going to take a look at how something like this might manifest itself in Logpoint in a relatively real-world scenario. It's an interesting question as to how would you spot data exfiltration in your environment. And in this case, I'm going to filter on a specific MITRE attack category, which in this case is actually lateral movement. But it could be something like this that you spot on your Logpoint as an incident. Now, this is lateral movement. This is not necessarily data exfiltration. And it's quite possible that you don't really know that there's that data exfiltration happening. It depends on what you're monitoring and what the data is and how you monitor it and so on. The worst case scenario would be that your trigger for this is you find your sensitive data somewhere else, or a newspaper contacts you and says, we have your bank account details or something like that. So that's obviously what we're trying to avoid. And for that reason, I was going to take a quick look at this screen here, which you might be familiar with. It's certainly the MITRE framework. It's from our alert rules where we map them across. And it's important to remember that any kind of attack, but certainly data exfiltration, probably doesn't start there. It starts somewhere much earlier. And you can see the different stages. Data exfiltration is relatively late. It's pretty much, the impact stage. But to get there, the attackers need to go through all of these stages. A lot of focus in custom environments is at these initial stages, where usually the endpoint agents, EDR, even XDR operate. But when something is successful, some defense in this area has probably failed. So that's the danger if you're relying just on these initial detections. And that is where kind of these later stage alert rules in Logpoint can be really useful. So in this case, as I mentioned, it was lateral movement. The ones that triggered these incidents, if we take a look at here, were specifically in this sub-technique of pass the hash. And if we look at how those rules are defined here, as a log source, you can see they just rely on Windows logs. So that's nice. So you don't have to deploy Sysmon. We will be using Sysmon data much later when we kind of investigate it. But in this case, you need Windows logs. It is important, though, that you collect them from all of your machines and also that you have Windows audit policies enabled. So when we're talking about something like a pass the hash attack, if you have login events, they need to be logged and they aren't by default. So you need to make sure that they are logged and then obviously logged in Logpoint as well. If we look at the rule definition, so the first one that was triggered was this possible pass the hash activity. Now, it's interesting to see what would happen in your Windows event logs, and that's why we provide these rules, so you don't have to write these yourself. But essentially, in this scenario, what we would see is this logon type 9, which is a new credential type logon, which is quite rare. So that's what happens when you run a command line /run as administrator or something like that. Now, that could happen in a real-world scenario, but out of your users, very few will be opening a DOS prompt and adding something run as. So that in itself can be an indicator. And then the question is, what do you do afterwards? And I'll come to that. But the initial detection could be as simple as that. There's a different login behavior here that would also be a pass the hash attack. That's a login type 3, where it's using the kind of slightly insecure NTLM authentication. But in either case, this would get triggered when someone is trying to run this type of command, or rather this type of logon. And then the question would be, how did they get this hash? Ideally, we would hope that some of the early alert rules would pick that up, or maybe your EDR agent. But if there's data exfiltration happening, or the risk of it happening, then clearly something didn't pick that up. Maybe there's a new exploit. Maybe there's a new way of getting a hash from memory when you're on a machine. There is probably something in the sequence of events that they carried out that we aren't aware of. So that's the one of the rules. And then the second one is lateral movement, literally the lateral movements. The first one is pass the hash to impersonate a user. The second one is then to hop onto another user, in this case using Mimikatz, where it's the same type of event, which is here is the first stream, but then it is followed by another login behavior, and it's specifically 4672, which is privileges getting assigned to an account. So again, that would be happening in what's called an overpass the hash attack, or a pass the key, I think they call it, where they're using credentials that they've harvested from a machine that they clearly hijacked already to impersonate an administrator account, a domain administrator account. And there's a lot of mitigation techniques on that, but that is a really common attack. It's affected loads of people over the last few years. It's still going on. If you're logging in with domain accounts on machines that are just locally compromised, whether that's the stolen hash or whether that's literally a guest password, then you might be leaving behind hashes of your domain admin account on that machine that they then can use to issue Kerberos requests and get valid Kerberos tickets back, and then they are in your wider network. So that's kind of the definition of lateral movement. So in our case, that might be the only thing that we saw. And the two areas that I wanted to focus on is, one, how do we detect it? This is one step of the MITRE chain where you might spot this happening. And then the second question is, what do you do when you see something like this? And that's where we've, in this particular case, have created a search template. But I just wanted to go through that a little bit to give you an idea of what you could be doing in your environment. So if I have the, actually, if we go back to the incidents, so I've got the incident data here for the incident. There's two important things that I see on here without having to write any search queries and so on. That's what pops up with these alert rules when they're turned on. So firstly, there's a host that this was carried out on. And secondly, there's a user that did this. And this is the information that we can take into that search template that I've mentioned. So we just want to know what was going on with this user, Kevin Stokes. So if I update this particular search template on Kevin Stokes, I'm getting all sorts of information back. And that's really where search templates are useful. You can write these searches relatively easily. You can take them from other dashboards, but just to as an idea. So firstly, successful pass the hash execution. That's just showing for this user, yes, we've entered the right one. This brings back the log point incidents that we have for that user. Secondly, though, what machines did Kevin Stokes log in on? It's relatively straightforward, where we can see he logged on the file server, the email server, and his desktop IT machine that all of this was happening on. So from that alone, we can see, okay, he's touched a few other systems, especially these two, we're not entirely happy about. And then the other thing, which is quite an interesting thing to do, is we are getting his, we're saying web browser access, but what it is actually is from his desktop IT endpoint, the sysmon logs via the logpoint agent X of the DNS requests that this user carried out with his browser executable. So you can get that level of detail if you have agent X and you have sysmon data on an endpoint. And in this case, we cross-reference that against an IOC list where it fished out, oh, these ones are dodgy. That is obviously something that maybe we should have stopped on beforehand. Maybe that should have been an alert in itself. Maybe this would have been stopped by some kind of web proxy, who knows? But it's an interesting kind of technique to see what this user was doing on that machine. And then also, this one is kind of, we call it malicious file access, but it's essentially any process creation on a machine that isn't his own. Is kind of the rule set behind it. So we can see that Kevin Stokes actually executed something on this email server host. Now, again, that kind of logic might not work for everyone if you have administrator users, but there's lots of ways in which you can exclude those kind of users. But for the vast majority of your user accounts, it shouldn't be possible to do this, or you shouldn't expect that to happen. And maybe there is a legitimate reason, but it's the kind of thing that you either want to be warned about or that you want to really look at when you're investigating someone like Kevin Stokes. So this is kind of suspicious access monitoring. We've got a second template where we can, again, just punch in Kevin Stokes. This is all the threat protection status on the machines that he's touched. And miraculously, Windows Defender has been disabled on all of these. Now, that's, again, a common behavior when you see these types of attacks. If someone, you might have protection against even past the hash attacks, but someone might have turned them off. To Gail's earlier point, it might be inside a threat. It might be, an oversight somewhere that was already turned off, or it might be limited permissions that they are able to turn certain protections off, which then means they can do more things later. In a similar vein, this services manipulation is literally just looking for anything that's using the SC command, which is, again, something that, especially on a command line, often happens. They're starting and stopping services, stopping the firewall service, and so on. And again, a regular user wouldn't be running commands like that. They would neither commands like that. You could have a different visualization that just looks at process terminations and so on. That shouldn't really happen either. And then lastly, we've got file integrity monitoring logs with Agent X from various machines. But in this case, the file server, that is the one that they have accessed. So this is the files that Kevin Stokes touched there. And then also maybe certain locations on his own laptop where we're monitoring what the activity is. Now, that might not really tell us something, but it might do, especially if we're kind of expanding it to, the environments. And it wouldn't have to be just file servers. It could be something like SharePoint folders and whatever else they might be accessing. And then lastly, under file download, there's two more interesting areas. So FTP access, FTP still is a common way in which people move their data across. Again, it's based on the DNS requests actually from that machine, and it could be any machine if we have those logs, but certainly by Kevin Stokes. And in this case, again, it's the web server process. Now, in the real world, there would probably be lots and lots of other processes, but you could create a really simple list where you have the most common browser executable names, and then you could always know the kind of browser activity they have, even if you don't have that at a network level with, as I said, web proxies and so on in between. You can literally get it from the endpoint. So in this case, we can see that they have indeed accessed FTP servers. Which some browsers now don't even allow you to do. I think Firefox still does, and that's precisely how they accessed some kind of location and uploaded files. And then equally, we can see what files this user downloaded. And again, we can see that on all the machines, and you can see on the email server, quite helpfully, he downloaded something called Trojan malware, just to make it a bit easier for us. But in any case, this is essentially, again, sysmon data on those machines. And there's a special sysmon event ID, I think it's 15, where it monitors the streams that are created and then closed. And that's what happens when people download files on a browser. They always get written temporarily, and then they get closed and moved. So that's how you can kind of limit your visibility to just what the browsers are doing rather than whatever other file access activity that might be happening on that system. So again, in one place, that could give you quite a good idea of where they downloaded things. Certainly, if it's not their host, their own workstation machine, that would be interesting. But also just generally, maybe the last 24 hours, what did they download in their browser? If you limit it down like that, it can be quite targeted. So it doesn't always have to be overwhelming amounts of information if you're a bit kind of clever about what you limit on. So where would that leave us in this case? Well, we would at least have an idea. Oh, it looks like Kevin Stokes, that account indeed, had malware that they executed on the email server. If that wasn't handily named Trojan, it would still be really unusual for them to execute anything on any server, certainly. If we catch it early enough, we might be able to, stop something. Obviously, in this case, it's probably a bit too late. But at the very least, we could then determine what was stolen, which user was involved. potentially, are there any other users that have behaved like that? And obviously, our nirvana would be that at any one of these stages, maybe we would have had a SOAR playbook to kind of shut this down. Ideally, this would have never happened. There would have been some kind of endpoint agent that would have stopped the initial Trojan. But that is precisely what, unfortunately, always comes up again, that something can't be stopped or is not yet detected, zero-day attacks and so on. And then also there are obviously lots of mitigations that you can have against pass the hash and so on. But the basic principle will always remain that someone will be potentially accessing something, and it won't necessarily be either detected or stopped. But certainly there will be certain behaviors that happen after the fact or in the process of this attack that might give you the opportunity to stop this then. And that's all I had at this stage.
Thank you very much, Niels. That was really interesting. So I'm just going to quickly go back to the slideshow, and you do have a couple of questions. So let me just ask the first one. So the first one is, you talked about, so the initial detection in the scenario was all around lateral movement. What could you do to detect data exfiltration itself?
Yes, so that's obviously a wide field. I kind of alluded to it when I was talking about file integrity monitoring. That's one part of it, but it's also Windows file auditing, just to know what activity there is. On certain filers, you'd have access monitoring, CEE on Dell, and there's also NetApp filers that can do that kind of thing. And also Office 365 and so on have logs of the access. And then it's a question of what you do when you monitor in there. For example, you can create whitelists or blacklists. If you have kind of PCI requirements, you could determine certain locations that you want to monitor for access. Obviously, the best thing to do is to prevent too many people from having access to these kinds of locations. But if for whatever reason they need to have access, you can do that kind of monitoring and or alerting. You can do certain thresholds on activity and so on. So it's kind of almost a separate discussion on how you could potentially monitor for data exfiltration itself. There's also certain alert rules we have. There's obviously certain other ways in which people access data that might not involve a compromised user accounts, and those can sometimes be picked up as well.
Great, thank you very much. So just to finish off, so I just wanted to share some information with you around some other assets that we have around data exfiltration. The demo that Niels just has gone through was extremely interesting. We do have a similar product tour on our website, specifically around data exfiltration and pass the hash. So if you go onto the website and look under product tours, you can find that. Take you 5 to 10 minutes to go through yourself. We also have a very interesting blog that talks about the whole topic. And as I mentioned, we do have, this will be recorded and it will be available on demand in the next few days. And as I mentioned right at the beginning of the session, we have been doing a number of these webinars around maximising your investment in Converged SIEM. We had the first one last week around ransomware. If you missed it, it's now available on demand on our website. So if you go to the webinar page, you can find it. You don't need to register for it. You can just go ahead and review it. And we also have the next week at the same time, so 3 o'clock Central EMEA time, we have our final one for this year, which is around maximising your investment in Converged SIEM with threat hunting, which I'm sure will be a very interesting session. We also will be continuing a new series of these in the new year. So I'd just like to say thank you to Niels for a great demo, and thank you to you for attending. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. So thank you very much for your time and have a great day. Thank you.